The girl was 18-year-old Savannah Soto. She was born April 22nd, 2005, and raised in San Antonio amongst her parents Pedro Soto and Gloria Cordova. And amongst her family, she was really known as a sweet-hearted, nurturing, caring, and happy individual. And although she was that only daughter and sister and known as the light amongst her family, she also was dating. And her boyfriend was Matthew Guerra, who was 22 years old, and they actually had some dark sides to their relationship. Some aspects that would later unfold throughout this entire story, where any relationship has its hardships, but this one in particular had some certain aspects about it and certain qualities that would shed light to just how she might have passed away throughout this story. Christmas time was approaching in the Leon Valley area of San Antonio, Texas, where a family of 9 was not only preparing for the holiday celebrations, but they were also planning to welcome a newborn baby just hours before that Christmas Eve day of 2023, where a member of that family, who is a very, very young girl and the only daughter and sister of the family out of 7 other boys, is the victim of this case. And although she was a soon-to-be mother to her firstborn child, Savannah not only faced a lot of different hardships throughout her own relationship, like any relationship might have its own problems of any extent, but she faced hardships throughout her personal life as well, within her own family, as she was grieving through the loss of a family member. Now, this would be part of the different layerings throughout this case and the dark and twisty nature of how all of this came to be, not only throughout the death of a family member, but multiple deaths, and including her own. And throughout my investigations around this case and for the coverage that there might be out there about Savannah, there really isn't much. But from what I have gathered, there is some really dark, twisted, dreadful, depressing, saddening, you name it, lonely facts that surround this case and the family members, or just how each role came to play out in this crime investigation. And it all really starts out with Savannah around the Christmas time, when she's kind of preparing to gather Christmas gifts for her family. She was preparing to gift her family members really thoughtful things that would mean a lot to them going forward. And not only was she doing that and preparing to deliver her newborn baby, but she was actually having trouble with this delivery, and so much trouble, in fact, that she was actually awaiting to get help from a nearby hospital. This hospital would help her deliver her baby. Savannah was initially scheduled to give birth to her baby December 23rd, 2023, and had an appointment that night at Stone Oak Methodist Hospital, and she was going to prepare with her mother. Her mother was a part of the family members that would go there to give support, help her through this stressful time as a hand to hold. And it wasn't actually a regular labor or pregnancy for that matter, as she was planning to have it medically induced. But things didn't go as planned really to begin with. Not only was it going to be a medically induced labor, but Savannah actually didn't show up to her mom at all. And leaving her mom empty-handed, wondering why she didn't show up to meet with her mom to go to the hospital together, as the two of them had been talking about it. They had been preparing for this moment for weeks at this point. And so her mom was just genuinely puzzled that she was left alone and wondering what could have happened that she wouldn't be here on such an important, crucial day, especially for the health of the baby and herself. Reports of that appointment, and frankly the rest of that night, showed that Gloria, her mom, pretty much began going on a witch hunt to figure out what exactly would be the reasoning that Savannah wouldn't show up to the appointment. She would go to nearby areas of that neighborhood or any common places that she thought her daughter might have gone to instead, and she wasn't coming up with any results. After that, she'd go and report to police that Savannah hadn't shown up on Saturday to her appointment to have her labor medically induced, and she didn't know where she could have been.
Because I was supposed to call her to go when they induced her on Saturday. And when I called her all morning, she wasn't answering. I was going straight to voicemail. And we went to the hospital anyways, and she was a no-show. And that's when I called the cops.
But Matthew was also nowhere to be found, and he would have been right beside her throughout this time. At least he would have supposed to have been. Savannah was last seen at her apartment complex in the 6,000 block of Grissom Road in Leon Valley on the Friday the 22nd, and since then she was just gone, apparently. Now, since Savannah was living with her boyfriend at the time, Matthew, and he was 22, about 4 years older than her, and that age difference is one thing in itself, but now they had both disappeared to Gloria's eyes, this was just not a good picture to paint for the entire situation. It was probably nerve-wracking for her mother, and at that point, she had officially reported her missing, and this was an ongoing thing that would continue to escalate, and this was just the beginning.
I just need to know that she's okay. She's in danger. I just want her to come back home. I don't know why she did this or what the whole situation is, but whoever seen her, and if she's doing this against her will, for her to try to get some kind of reach to get to me or to get to the police or something, because we do want her home. We need her home. I just need to know that she's okay, and the baby especially. I don't even know if she's at the baby.
And along with Savannah's mom making statements to local authorities, local news stations, and openly saying how worried she was about the entire situation and her feelings around it, she wasn't the only family member to speak on this subject, and her sister-in-law, Savannah's sister-in-law, would actually go on Facebook and platforms like it, making multiple statements, multiple posts, just openly speaking about her feelings towards the situation, and sort of describing how Matthew was in terms of how he dealt with the relationship and how he treated Savannah, and describing him as abusive. And things like, I don't want you to become a statistic, part of the statistics that happens when you are a female, a girl in a relationship with an abusive boyfriend. I don't want that to happen to you. I want you to just be safe, come home. This is where you're supposed to be. You need to come to the realization that you should have the upfrontmost safety and healthy situation for you and your baby. Just come home. Please just come home, find your way home, Vanna, is what she would call her. Her older brother, Jordan, who was 30 years old at the time, also said some similar things to her sister-in-law. They kind of agreed with each other in terms of him saying that it was in fact an abusive relationship. They didn't approve of it. Neither side of the family really approved of it. They wanted her to leave Matthew. They didn't want them to stay in a long-term relationship as a couple, and Savannah just wasn't having it. She really seemed like she was more so interested in keeping the relationship together, trying to find a healthy balance to it, trying to have that nurturing situation, and trying to just make things work with Matthew. But was it really working at this point? And while maybe things getting hard was really just a drastic understatement of the entire situation, because not only did he abuse her, but he beat her and he hit her. Not only did he do that, but he was screaming at her while he did it, saying things like, F you, B-word, you betrayed me, while he would kick her in the face, in the head, multiple times while she was on the floor. Now, Matthew's defense attorney for this entire situation of that abuse incident, well, he wouldn't just paint the two in a better light, but he would go as far as to say that he had met Savannah, and she was a really nice person, really sweet, and really caring. But not only that, the two were back together again as soon as they were able to be together again, even after what he had done to her. And I guess that goes to show, as far as how the family didn't want them together, they were going to stay together pretty much at all costs. And his defense attorney wasn't really the only one to paint the both of them in a better light, because Matthew's mom actually made some statements about that situation as well that were also in parallel with the defense attorney, saying that, well, she knew her son, she knew him well, and he's not that type of person. He wouldn't do something like that to her. And meanwhile, the investigations took place after that initial reporting that Gloria made, and as she was working with the police to get more information, the Leon Valley Police Department actually tried themselves to get into her apartment. Maybe they had tried to see what was going on through a window or tried to get in through the front door in terms of using force, but they couldn't get in after multiple attempts. And after that, they had still decided to stay at that area and interview the family more, just to try and paint a better picture of where she could have been, what her whereabouts were beforehand, what she might have been driving, and they were eventually able to determine that she was driving a 2013 Kia Optima that was in gray color and had a temporary Texas tag on it. And as the conversations went on with those officers and talking with the family, well, Gloria would continue to make statements about Savannah and just trying to describe who she was as a person and why it was so weird that she didn't show up for her labor induction, saying things like she was so happy to be a mom. She was prepared, excited, looking forward to it. She was so much prepared that she even made a whole nursery for the baby before the baby had even gotten delivered. And not only that, but how it was so strange for her mom. Now that they're trying to search for Savannah, and they're still grieving with the loss of losing another family member during this time. And that part actually goes into another crime scene investigation, another case from a couple of years ago in 2022 with their younger brother Ethan Soto, where they had been dealing with his loss. They had been grieving through him. And now, well, Gloria had been dealing with possibly the missing child of her only daughter.
That I love him, that I miss him. I would have never let him go. I would never let him go.
And it was just so hard for her to deal with this. She would explain to her kids that she felt empty. She felt the loss, and it was just not the same for her. And now she had to potentially consider that, well, she had to worry about Savannah in the same way.
I have a lot of questions, and I start going to what if. I don't even, there's not even that one lead. That lead just, it was like a dead end, and it ended.
From those initial statements of the families about Savannah to the police department and that report of her missing, well, the Texas Department of Public Safety finally issued a clear report, one of those reports that state different things about the height, weight, eye color, things like that about Savannah. Now that they had been compiling these facts that she was 9 months pregnant, a week overdue for her induced labor, and they were now to go into deeper facts and investigations about this entire thing and releasing reports to try and figure out where she might have gone. Authorities had now known that she had last been seen on the 22nd, about a day before, around 2 p.m. with Matthew in that 6,000 block of Grissom Road in Leon Valley where their apartment was, and that she was driving that 2013 Kia Optima, which is what was a part of this report in terms of the community trying to help establish some sort of visuals for her now that they had gone deeper into their whole search. Now at this point, if only the Department of Public Safety for Texas had issued this clear report a little bit earlier so that people would know exactly what to look for who this person was and what they were driving, because a resident on the northwest side, which is a totally different area where they had an apartment complex, they actually had spotted what they thought was the right description of a car. This car that was awkwardly parked in this area that there usually isn't some car parked, and this resident described it as a matching description. But as far as the situation goes, this wasn't going to turn out good. This wasn't a good situation for the car being on the opposite side of town in this location at a completely different apartment complex in a more secluded street area where, well, Savannah didn't usually go. And so it was the beginning of the dark and twisted nature of what this case would turn out to be.
There are 2 people in the car.
Are they dead?
They are deceased. And we believe that it is the missing woman and her boyfriend, but we can't confirm that right now officially until the medical examiner takes a look at the bodies and makes that determination as to their identity. And detectives right now are looking at this as a possible murder, but we don't know for sure.
But sadly, this one statement alone would be the beginning of the family's worst nightmares in terms of Savannah missing, and it was already days that have passed. In fact, it was the 27th of December already. Christmas had already passed. The family had been worrying for days this entire time, and instead of this car being the means of transportation for Savannah and Matthew to the hospital or to meet with her mom for her scheduled induction appointment, it had now become their location of death.
The medical examiner had identified 22-year-old Matthew as one of the deceased victims in the vehicle, and he died from a gunshot wound to the head. The manner of that death is still pending. The second deceased victim has not yet been officially identified by the medical examiner. However, I think we can be confident that that second victim was Savannah.
The local police department also had a part in how detectives and the police were presenting this to the community at the conference. They were trying to describe things and what they saw, how the scene came to be, and even the family was there. They had to listen to all of this, as the police chief officer McManus described it as a very, very perplexing crime scene. And everyone there was just really distraught. In terms of especially the sister-in-law, she was actually there at the crime scene.
We were supposed to celebrate Christmas with her and the baby. All she wanted was that baby. I think she was meant to be a mom.
And at that point, they got a little bit closer. The police department ended up coming out with an announcement that they were now looking for 2 suspects, and these suspects were now going to be potentially charged with capital murder if they were found. Alright everyone, before we get into the rest of this Crime Entries episode, if you believe that Savannah, Matthew, and their baby Fabian deserve justice, in the next 5 seconds, deep dive into that subscribe button. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Did you do it? Yeah? Okay, let's move on. Not only that, but they actually had found some camera surveillance footage of that area and the night that the car was left. They found a Chevy Silverado of a dark color and the Kia Optima. Both cars were there at the same time, and now they had pinpointed maybe a more precise location of where that Chevy Silverado was. They found a nearby similar-looking Chevy at a nearby house and pinpointed that this may be the exact house of where the murderers were living that they were looking for. Now, in that surveillance footage of showing the two vehicles, the police department saw that there were people driving those vehicles, and they determined that those people obviously weren't Matthew and Savannah, that those were the murderers of the crime scene, and they had also theorized that they were probably killed at a different location and then moved to that location. And so they went ahead and moved forward with an arrest of the people that were living at that residence near where the camera surveillance footage was taken. A bit of time had passed after that point, and detectives were really still just trying to pinpoint some more precise locations or times at which they had ended up at that spot. In terms of finding their phones, both Savannah's and Matthew's, they found both their phones and they were pinpointing some more exact locations, which ended up being Charlie Chan Drive and Cary Grant Drive at around 11 p.m. that night on the 21st. So police officers went to that residence, the house at which that Chevy Silverado lookalike was in the surveillance footage, and the first person to answer the door to the police was Ramon Preciado. He actually answered but didn't really give them any information up front, besides saying, "Yeah, I know why you're here, but you should talk to my son." So he led the police officers to his son, Christopher Preciado, and both of them were taken into custody and into questioning to figure out what they were doing at the scene and why they were driving that Chevy and what they were planning on doing as far as why they were both involved. And Ramon actually had identified himself as one of the people that were in that surveillance footage, saying like, "Yeah, that is me. I'm the one driving the dark Chevy Silverado. My son is driving the Kia." And they both drove away right after getting out of the cars and talking to each other briefly and leaving the crime scene for that following day of the footage to be found. And about a day later after that, the Bexar County District Attorney Joe Gonzalez actually came out to say that whoever was the main suspect of this case was going to be charged with the capital murder, and it was suspected to be Christopher. But not only was it capital murder, but it was because he not only had killed Matthew and Savannah, but 3 people total because of the unborn baby.
We're going to try and expedite these cases as fast as we can under the laws of Texas, and could be and should be considered as a person in terms of whether or not to add an additional count.
During that initial interrogation and questioning of Ramon and Christopher, well, it didn't take long, and eventually Christopher actually admitted to killing both Matthew and Savannah in their car, but he actually claimed that it was in self-defense. Now, I don't know how that can happen in self-defense, but after that, well, they were both charged. He was charged with murder, and Ramon was actually charged with abuse of corpse, because he always removed the body and ended up in that Kia Optima on that random street corner. It's crazy at this point because Christopher was actually 19. He wasn't even that much older than Savannah was at the time, and his father was about 53 years old. So obviously they knew the consequences. They were both adults, and it seemed like they were both teaming up and trying to get away with the evidence.
They want to know why.
Further besides that, because detectives found evidence along with the surveillance footage as to how they eventually attempted to try and conceal the corpses, to try and relieve some of the fingerprints or any of the blood that was found on the car.
I don't want to believe that she's gone. It hurts too much. She was my only daughter. All that was going through my mind was the baby. Is the baby still alive? Was she crying out for me? He used to abuse her. And I told her to get out of the relationship, but she was hard-headed.
After they had initially charged Christopher for the murder of the couple and Ramon for the abuse of the corpse and helping him hide the bodies, well, they had said that they had arrested the sole suspects.
These 2 individuals are the only suspects that we were looking for. Through interrogating the individuals, our detectives had enough, based on what they said, there was enough information there to get a warrant signed by a judge tonight, again, to charge Christopher with capital murder and Ramon with abuse of a corpse.
As I've said in previous episodes of Crime Entries, dealing with the loss of children, especially young ones that aren't even fully developed, maybe even over the age of 25, but 18, 19, 22, this is just such a tragedy. This is one of the worst ways that any family can deal with any tragedy or loss of a family member, especially a 15-year-old, and not only that, but the possibility of 2 kids at this point. It's just the really tragic thing that you never really want to hear. And I can't even imagine the tragedy that her mom felt when she had to deal with all of this, and that Savannah was missing and she was still coping with just a year after having lost Ethan. And not only that, but Ethan died in such a dull and pathetic manner, and it was around the same neighborhood as well, because he was still living at home. So it was literally a close to home situation that they had to now face. And because it was the result of a drug deal, a drug robbery, and Ethan getting mixed up with the wrong crowd that included THC products, in terms of how he stole from a dealer, and the dealer wasn't happy with him. So the dealer took it upon himself to get a underage girl and message Ethan on Instagram and set up a new drug deal where Ethan would go outside of his house and he would be able to catch him at that point. The Soto family was respectable for each other. They really respected each other. They were really grounded and really loved each other and were passionate people. So much so that when the entire trial for Ethan's murder was happening and the Soto family was there, they were angry, agitated. They wanted to take it out on somebody. And during the trial, they were seen in a courtroom video where they were trying to go after this dealer that killed their brother, their son. And not only that, but, well, guess who was a part of this? Yes, Matthew was also in the courtroom, seen with the family trying to beat upon this drug dealer that killed Ethan. So it begs the question of, how close were Matthew and Ethan to drug dealers? How was this community thriving in terms of what the streets were like? Were they both involved in drugs, and this was a compiling circumstance throughout these couple of years of these things just finally leading up to what would happen to them and how dangerous it was for their environments? And Gloria would also make statements about that courtroom fight in terms of how she was aggravated, that she had to deal with that loss of Ethan and the entire family trying to get the dealer in the courtroom. Savannah knows what I've gone through with Ethan, and I know that she doesn't want me to go through this again with her, and she knows that I just want her to be okay rather than being judged by anybody for what she had gone through with her boyfriend. And her grandma also had come forward with a few statements.
She was a good girl. She didn't deserve to go this way, especially with her baby. He was an innocent child. Nobody deserved this. Prayers were answered, but not for what I wanted. My heart is broken right now. And nothing's ever going to replace her. But she was a heart. She was beautiful inside and out.
Evidence scattered around the car showed drag marks, especially drag marks on Matthew's back, that showed that he had been strategically placed in the back seat of the car while she was still in the front seat of the car. This was questionable because in that surveillance footage there was more to be seen, and eventually the detectives and police department would say that they were also looking for a third suspect, and not only that, but Matthew nor anyone else involved besides Ramon and his son were to be involved in the suspects of who murdered these 2 people. They were the only ones to be dealt with. And now they were continuing the witch hunt for who might have been the third suspect to help them in concealing evidence. Now, part of that potential third suspect, well, since Ramon and Christopher had already admitted and been charged to the murder and abuse of the corpse, well, they had found an actual casing of a bullet that was at the crime scene and probably used to murder the 2 people. But not only that, they didn't find a gun to go along with it. So now they were on a hunt to find the gun and who exactly was the owner of it, because since that was the murder weapon used and the 2 men hadn't used it, well, they now had to go on a witch hunt for the third suspect. And they had thought that it was actually the stepmother of Christopher. And this stepmother was thought to be a person in that actual surveillance footage that was seen to be throwing a towel from the Chevy Silverado or from one of the vehicles to someone else in the footage to wipe down evidence, as if that wasn't so extremely obvious. They didn't even have it wrapped up in their clothing or anything, and the entire family just seems super sloppy at this point as far as where everything is leading them to, because of that shell casing, and acting like taking the gun away from the crime scene is going to help them get away with anything. After that, they did go further on and charge Christopher with the same charges that they gave Ramon, so that abuse of corpse. And it just really makes me sick to my stomach to think about all of this and how pathetic this manner was and the entire gruesome atmosphere of the crime scene, because it was just because of a drug deal gone bad. That's what they were claiming, and that's how they were suspected to have known each other initially in the first place. Matthew and Savannah, as far as how they were interacting with these people and how they ended up dead, that these people took advantage of them because of the drug deal gone south. And it's just, how many times is this going to happen throughout this period? And not only why was it so pathetic that it ended up being for this crime scene and how dull it was for these people to do something so terrible, but the stepmother, Myrta Romanos, she was living with the two men, which is why she was seen in this footage throwing a towel. And not only that, but she was also found to have been the owner of this gun, the firearm that was not found at the crime scene, but it was found with her in the house. And she was actually charged with abuse of a corpse and tampering with evidence. Pretty much everything that the two men were being charged with. They were going down as a trio. And not only was Myrta a part of all of this, but
Myrta, did you give Christopher your gun?
This claim. She said that she was asleep the entire time.
Did you give Christopher your gun to use in this murder?
And detectives didn't really have.
Are you sorry?
They had actually seen her in this footage driving back to the home, so she couldn't.
Did you give Christopher your gun?
Of how she ended up with the two men.
How can you sleep at night?
And after that, on the 10th, when she was in her trial testifying,
how have you been able to sleep at night?
Well, I've been having a lot of troubles in my life. She tried to make excuses for herself and make the court feel bad for her. Wrong person at the wrong place at the wrong time type of thing, saying that she had some financial troubles. But this wasn't going to help her at all, and she was going to continue getting her justice and charges against her. That's what she deserved at this point. For someone to say that they're asleep and be so careless, I can't even. Now, throughout the trials, Christopher would go on to continue dragging Matthew's presence about this entire trial in a bad light. No pun intended, but he would go on to say that they were at his house to sell him cannabis, that Matthew was the one doing this. And it would go on further to say that detectives had actually found that, well, Matthew was a drug dealer, and he would actually post to his Instagram, not just updates about the drugs that he was dealing, but different things that he was doing within that community. And so just how much was he involved in all of this? Could he have brought this whole situation upon himself now that Christopher was claiming that he was a drug dealer that was showing up at his house now that he had claimed self-defense? What was all this going to end up being? So at this point, things weren't really adding up for Christopher, because detectives during his questioning had heard something completely different from him than what Matthew's parents had told them already, and that is that people had tried to rob Matthew and they'd shot at him before. So maybe this was his family trying to get there before Christopher had said anything in terms of defending Matthew and saying that maybe Christopher was just out to get him and that's how he got shot.
Made the best decisions, but I'll make no excuses for him, but whatever he did, I don't condone that at all. But that being said, no one deserves to be murdered, period, regardless of what kind of activity you're in or what you're doing.
But Christopher's story was much different from that, in terms of being a lot darker and a lot more accidental from Christopher's point of view, which is that when Savannah and Matthew had shown up to Christopher's house to sell him cannabis, that, well, Matthew had eventually pulled out a gun and aimed it at Christopher's face. So then this is when Christopher had started to act in self-defense, in terms of manipulating the gun, taking it from Matthew and wrestling him with it. This is when the entire situation got a lot more escalated. He was able to manipulate it and shoot Matthew in the head. Not only that, but he then manipulated it again from Savannah, which is another altercation in the same moment within these three people. So eventually detectives pretty much said that this was inconsistent and Christopher's story didn't add up. Even if he was telling the truth, it didn't add up with how the gunshot wounds were inflicted on both Matthew and Savannah, and for that fact, he would either be punishable on the capital murder for the death penalty or life imprisonment, and it was just a matter of time on a little bit more evidence that they would gather throughout this investigation on whether he'd be indicted on either of those things. But the trial would go on, and it would get even worse. So police would go on to say that instead of his story being accurate, that he knowingly, with intent, shot both of them in the head, knowing that Savannah was pregnant, and knowingly misguided and mishandled the bodies, trying to move them from place to places, where they were found at that 5903 Danny Kaye Drive. And after that, well, he was charged, him and his father Ramon. Ramon was actually charged with a bond of $600,000 total, and, well, as far as Christopher, he got a $2 million bond. So at this point, there was some positive justice that they were given such high bail bonds and they were never able to pay those. They were never going to be able to afford those at $600,000 and $2 million, plus those original charges that they were given, especially with the capital murder charge. But there were also some gray areas in terms of how, well, Matthew's family had initially said that, well, Matthew had been shot before, but in the warrant affidavit, they actually was never any proof that they knew each other, that the Preciados and the Sotos, they were just at the wrong place at the wrong time. So Savannah, she was shot dead in the head just about 19 months after her brother Ethan had been killed for that drug money that he had been lured out of his house for.
He comes in there and knocks on the door, and he says, "I love you, Mom." And I opened the door and I said, "I love you too, son. Just let's drop this and just move on. And okay, I love you." And he gave me a hug, which, had that not happened and we would have stayed upset, that would have weighed heavy on me.
It was just those two young lives gone too soon. They had such a huge future ahead of them, especially with the unborn baby Fabian, and knowing that they wanted to be there as parents, they were trying to work out their relationship, even after the abuse that she had gone through. But her older brother Jordan had continued to give some statements about that situation, in terms of saying that he never really even knew that Matthew was in this drug business, that he was dealing or he was involved with the wrong crowd, and that wasn't really what he was even paying attention to. He really just wanted to make sure that his sister was going to be okay, that his sister was doing the right thing and going to be there for her baby, even though it ended up being this tragic event. But as far as the boyfriend goes, he also said that he was the way that he was, and he really didn't take anything else for an answer, that he did his thing, and he led the life that he wanted to lead. But I guess Savannah just really wanted to maintain a healthy part of that relationship and trying to make things work overall. But it doesn't make sense, because if she was so innocent, then why could she have led that environment to be so toxic in the end of her life? So as far as the murder family goes, with the Preciados and the Bexar County records of that police department, well, Christopher, the main suspect that had all of this to deal with in terms of killing the two people, he actually has no prior records, and that was supposed to be helpful for him, but in the end it wasn't, especially with his dad, who has multiple aggravated arrest assaults and evading arrest with a deadly weapon, dating all the way back to 1988. And so it seems like that entire family was just up to no good to begin with. And as much as his stepmother had, well, she actually got her bond reduced from about $1.2 million down to $600,000. That part doesn't make any sense, because she was as very much a part of this as the two men were, especially with claiming that she was asleep. And how pathetic can that be in the end? She pretty much got away with $500,000 of charges. And, well, Murda wasn't the only one to get off sort of easy with her bond either, because there was another family member that got their bond reduced. And Sergeant Washington Moscoso would go on to state that Ramon actually wasn't present as an accomplice in the killings of the two people. He was more so just involved in moving the bodies and helping hide evidence, which doesn't also make sense to me, because if he was involved in such gruesome acts, then he should have also been charged to the highest extent. You're literally moving dead corpses around and helping your son put them in a car, but it's not enough for the court to charge him, apparently. It just doesn't seem right. And on top of that, his bond was also reduced from $600,000 to about $350,000, because during his jail time and how he was initially spending time in the prison, well, his medication was a little bit mixed up. He was having high blood pressure as well as high potassium levels, along with a spider bite that turned into a sort of staph infection, and the medication that the jail gave him was wrong on multiple occasions, so he used that as a sort of rebuttal to get his bond reduced, and even tried to get out sooner than he was intended to stay. They would go on to have their set trial date in the district court for May 20th of this year, and throughout that, they would go on to serve their time and their bonds, and they're not out at this point, but there is no further information on top of that. As far as how they would be indicted or where Christopher would end up, whether he'd get his life in prison or the death penalty for his capital murder. And on top of that, they had actually set up GoFundMe pages for each of the families. In terms of Matthew and Savannah, the only sad part is, if it is any case of being compassionate for Matthew, is that, well, Savannah, she had almost 10 to 20,000 of donations for her GoFundMe page and her funeral expenses, while Matthew, as far as his goal of 10,000 from his family, he was only able to get about 1,000 of that covered. And so, while each family is drastically different, there is more information as far as if the families are going to get along, and her father had some things to say about, well, it's their decision for what they want to do as far as the abuse that was happening in the years prior, but nonetheless, the families would continue to go on with their lives and just go day by day. And as far as they had a vigil for the baby and for Savannah, for Matthew as well. And that ended up happening on the 28th, which is really depressing because instead of celebrating with the new year, a newborn baby, and a young family that had a lot of life left to live, they instead had to celebrate it in deaths. And that is just one of the most tragic things about this case, especially that it happened around the holidays.
Matthew's father reached out to me yesterday and said that he wanted to give me something. He didn't tell me what it was, but I kind of felt it was a good thing, you know. So he reached out to me. We made up yesterday. He gave me these gifts. These will be the last gifts I'll receive from my daughter, you know. It's going to mean a lot to me. It means a lot to me. I'm going to put them up. And every year Christmas comes around, I'll take them out, you know, as a memory from my heart. I love them.
You know, there's been tension, but because of, you know, everything, the time that's passed, and now that everything is kind of settled and people are behind bars and that's going, you seem to think that the families are going to unite and just put the differences aside. And
I can only speak from my side of the family. You know, we will continue talking to them. I think that's the right thing to do, you know. I'm sure they would want that. My daughter would want that. And I have nothing against them, you know.
Her brother Jordan, during the entire vigil and throughout the immediate times of grieving throughout the Christmas holiday, would go on to speak to news outlets and through the vigil, saying that there was a little bit of peace, at least, for the victim of his family being Savannah and the unborn baby, Fabian, but that there would be justice on both sides for her, as well as for the person that took her life. We went on to actually bury baby Fabian with Savannah in her casket, and in that case, it was a really, really wrong thing for the entire situation to unfold in that way. I mean, a newborn baby that had all this potential.
I just want to say something just real quick. I just want to just thank everybody. I honestly just got here, so I don't know who's here. But whether you're family, friends, strangers, from the bottom of my heart, my family's heart, you know, dad's side, mom's side, both sides, from our friends, we just want to thank you, everybody, thank you for real. It really means more than y'all will ever know, especially now that we got our answers. Next is just laying the princess to rest.
There are ongoing trials for all three of the murders, and while Ramon, the father of the murderer, he's actually getting charged on multiple counts, and they each come with 10 to 20 years of imprisonment. And one of those counts states as 3 counts of tampering with a human corpse, 3 counts of an abuse of human corpse, and 2 counts of tampering with any evidence, which totally makes sense as far as that matter goes. And knowing that he was 53 at the time of his charges, he's going to be spending probably the next 40 years in prison. So that's technically a life sentence of its own, which I think brings enough justice because he was just trying to cover up for his son that really showed no remorse to anyone of the situation. But he's not the only one to get time in prison. Christopher, who is the main murder suspect of this entire case, who actually shot the 2 people, well, he's still waiting his conviction for capital murder and might ultimately spend the rest of his life in prison on countless charges, really, because it just starts with capital murder and killing a child under the age of 10, along with just some petty petty robbery charges, but it goes on from there. His charges would continue as 3 counts of tampering with a human corpse, 3 counts of abuse of a human corpse, and 4 counts of tampering with evidence. Now, all 3 of them were indicted on all charges, which definitely is sort of satisfying for any justice that these families have to go through, and they ultimately deserve anything as far as the most highest extent that the court can put these murder suspects through, especially that while they're all in prison, their home at 5753 Charlie Chan Drive, it's actually up for sale while they're all spending time in prison. So even if the murder parents actually are able to get out before their deaths, they're not going to have anywhere to go. They might even end up being homeless, or they might just spend the rest of their lives in prison now that they can't pay their bond or have enough time after their lives of being pretty much 90 years old to have any sort of existence after that, which does bring some sort of balance to all of this, even though it'll never change the fact that, well, all of these 3 lives were taken. Even though they had a lot more to learn, they could have changed things up. They could have worked out their lives as a couple. So I want to know from all of you guys, what do you think as far as the justice and the balance of life that comes from all of this? Where do you think it goes from here? Because this family had to bury their daughter and their only sister along with her baby, and it never had to end up this way. It was all just because of petty drug problems that people could have made better decisions for, and they could have been a bit safer throughout their neighborhoods, but she missed her appointment, and it resulted in the worst possible situation. And, well, I just think it's such a tragic and dark thing to have to live through for each family, regardless of anything that happened in the past with their relationship. Nobody should ever have to go through anything so dark and twisted. Now, if you guys have found any insight from this episode, I encourage you to go watch another video on the channel. I'm going to be covering a lot more crime stories and cases, and I will see you in the next one.